You're listening to the Sixers Beat with your host, Derek Bodner, right here on LibertyBallers.com and LibertyBroadcast.co.
Welcome, everybody. This is Derek. I'm joined by Kyle Neubeck and Rich Hofmann on the latest Sixers Beat. Been a little while since we had one of these, but then again, there's not been a whole lot to really talk about. We'll probably have a quick podcast today, then maybe one either later on in the week or early next week when the season is officially over. But how you guys doing?
Surviving, man. Just trying to get through this end of the season lull.
Surviving. That's a good way to put it. We don't really have a whole lot to talk about in terms of news, although Ben Simmons did send out a check mark, which, because of the way news is disseminated in 2017, we are assuming that means that his scan on his foot went well and that he is healed, but we don't actually have any confirmation on that. Well, if something does break while we're recording this podcast, we'll let you know.
Source, Ben Simmons
tweets
is great.
But we will let you know, and then you can get that news 2 days later when you actually listen to this podcast. But before that, we will do a quick, kind of what our expectations were heading into the season and whether or not they were met, exceeded, disappointed, or whatnot. So I guess we'll just throw out the broad question and let you run wherever you want with it. How did this season go in terms of your expectations?
Well, okay. Like you mentioned, that's sort of a complicated question and answer there. But as far as team success, I think they probably ended up exceeding what I thought they would do, at least in terms of win-loss, because I knew that the talent was going to be much better, assuming that people were healthy, despite guys not being that healthy. But you knew there were going to be the growing pains, especially. We went into the season expecting one of the big storylines to be what is Ben Simmons' jumper like and how does that affect the team's play. And really that all went out the window once he was injured, and it was all about Joel Embiid and how great he was. And he was sort of this galvanizing force that the franchise really took off once he was on the court. So I think we finally saw it was a success to me because we finally saw that, yes, if Joel Embiid is on the court, he is a franchise-altering player and a potential superstar. And because that's what this whole rebuild was all about, that by any measure, that's a success now that you've seen that and you know that for sure, versus that just being an idea in your head based on scouting him in college games and so on and so forth. On the other hand, I don't know if I've ever felt more cynical or less trusting of the people making the decisions in terms of letting these guys play, whether they're healthy enough to play, what the timelines are, and just their general communication and prioritization of all those issues. And because they're building around a guy like Embiid, who does have very obvious medical red flags in his history, it makes me feel a little bit worse about the franchise moving forward than I might have. It makes me feel a little bit worse about Embiid's long-term health, not because I think he's any more or less prone to suffering injuries. Derek, I know you've written pieces about that, about how the confidence variable really hasn't changed. I think that was a very astute point, that it really shouldn't change all that much. It should probably hover in the same area, but my trust in the team to handle him correctly and really optimize his long-term future has taken a bit of a hit. So as far as what the team produced and my confidence in the talent that they have on hand, I'm feeling a lot better, but I am less certain, and I feel like it's I don't want to say a failure, but they've taken a hit as far as my perspective on how they're going to manage all of this moving forward.
I appreciate calling it an astute point. I assure you the next time the Harry's check comes in, you'll get a larger cut.
It's really a hard question because I think, along the same lines as what Kyle said, the players on the court, I think, probably took a step forward this year, although, that varies from guy to guy. The coach took a major step forward as far as his standing within the organization.
Remember when he was, we really thought he was on the edge.
Thin ice, yeah.
Yep, and he was the biggest winner of the season, which, it might not be the greatest thing because you obviously want that to be the players at some point. But for now, it's Brett Brown. And the front office, again, it's hard to judge, is it a failure when not a ton of stuff happened? Obviously, the Nerlens trade was pretty significant. And then the handling of all the injuries, but those could be temporary problems. But along those lines, I think you have to say I'm a little less confident in the front office after what we've seen this year, to maybe a good bit less confident. It's hard to exactly say. The one thing, though, that I will say, and this is important, Joel Embiid, I thought, was going to be the Rookie of the Year this year. He wildly outperformed my expectations. He is absolutely awesome. And I mean, like we said, this whole time, he's going to be a great player. The injuries are still a major concern. They never stop being a major concern. But I mean, this guy is clearly a top 5 player if he's healthy. And that's a terrifying prospect considering the injuries at the same time, but it's something to be really excited about. And, the Sixers just need to do everything in their power to get that guy healthy for next year and, try and get 10 good years out of this guy, because if they can do that, we're talking about, a championship level player to build around.
Yeah, it's really weird because, right, on the other hand, you can go up and down the roster from players who maybe aren't even really all that relevant long-term to players who are extremely relevant long-term. And every one of them outperformed our preseason expectations. Really, they did. You can go from Embiid to Covington to Dario to TJ to Rashawn to Luwawu, all these guys. Every one of them to a T outperformed expectations. But yet, by the same token, a lot of the same thoughts of, well, shit, man, this can be taken away from us in a second. In one landing, one awkward landing, one turn of an ankle, one whatever, this could all go away. And between Simmons and Embiid and the way both of those were handled, you're still left in that weird, state. So I think clearly what Rich said about Brett Brown, I mean, I feel 1,000 times more confident in it. We always talked about Brett being a great player development guy, but you went up and down, with the exception of Covington's defense. There wasn't a whole lot of players really taking their game to the next level. And a lot of that you could say, well, how many players had the talent to really go to another level? And I think this year, as we've seen him get more and more, real NBA level talent, or at least NBA level youth, he has made a lot of strides with a lot of these people, and that's great. And no stride bigger than Joel Embiid, who, like Rich said, for as lofty of expectations as we had, he is a completely different player than he was at Kansas. So I think both Embiid and Brown and the staff get credit for that. It's just, man, if it would have been 61 games instead of 31 games, and if Ben Simmons didn't, come down on his foot the way he did, Sean Long's foot, thanks, Sean, good couple of weeks, but you're going to have a hard time living that one down. If those two things didn't happen, I think the city would be on cloud 9, because then all these little things that we talk about, the TJs, the Covingtons, oh, that's not really little, but little in comparison, the Sharches, the Holmes, they all become, bonus. They all, that's gravy. And you just hope that, in 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, we're not talking about injuries anymore. I mean, we will, because it's impossible. But we're not at least talking about setbacks. We're not talking about people missing games. And we can start appreciating the little things. And I really do think that a lot of the Sixers fans, at least the ones who stuck through it, and really, after February 20 whatever, when you found out Embiid and Simmons were done for the year, the ones who stuck through it, I think they were rewarded with some, not necessarily wins of late, but some players who have made some real strides. But I hope we can be happy without qualification next year.
Yeah, well, and one thing that I was thinking about listening to what you guys said, we talk about this pretty often as far as trade negotiations and stuff, but first round picks in almost all cases, even top 3 picks like Joel Embiid was a couple years ago, their value is highest before the draft picks are made. Once it's a tangible player, it goes from, oh, wow, you have a chance at getting a superstar to, okay, you have Aaron Gordon, or you have like Dante Exum, or some guy who's taken in the draft that, yeah, these guys can be contributors for your team. But in most cases, they're not turning out to be the type of superstar that you would ideally want from that caliber of pick, or from a pick at all if you're in the lottery. But Joel Embiid, from what we saw this year, he is like exactly the type of player that, injuries aside, of course, which is a big aside, that's exactly what you're hoping. Like, I don't think as much as his injuries have impacted a lot of people's confidence, and I don't think his value has gone down. And I would say in other ways, his value has increased, at least to the Sixers. Like, can you imagine if they were so scared off by all this stuff that they decided to trade him this summer, despite what they had already seen? There would be a fucking mutiny in this town if they ever considered that, because if he ever went somewhere else and blossomed the way that we think he can, or even if he just maintained the level of play that he showed this year and was able to play the type of workload that a normal NBA player would do, that, like Rich said, that's a top 5 player in the league. That's a guy who can be a defensive player of the year, an MVP type candidate, a guy that you build your franchise around. And so, like, after all this time, after some misses in the draft, stacking up big men over and over again for a few years in a row, just hoping one of them would hit, and protecting yourself against the injuries for guys that you selected, you finally have seen there is a guy to anchor the franchise to. And yes, it's certainly scary that you're dealing with those health concerns still, and that they're not in the rearview mirror like you might have hoped. But just to be able to have that to hold on to is, even if you wouldn't consider it a success given the surrounding context, I think a lot of fans, a lot of people who have bought into this dramatic rebuilding process last few years, it's almost like a sigh of relief. Like, man, finally we have some reason to really keep believing that they're on the upward trajectory.
Yeah, and just as far as getting through the season, I mean, Derek, the last few games, when we were eating in the media room before the game, there wasn't a whole lot going on. We were kind of dicking around because there really wasn't a ton of stuff going on as far as important on-court, development or anything. But it was just the last few games. Like in December last year, it felt like that. Yeah. And
at least then we had Embiid to chase around the court, though.
That's true.
That's pretty much what we did. We ran around with a video recorder and watched Embiid.
And get 60,000 views on YouTube.
Yeah.
Because he was treated sort of like Bigfoot. They weren't a laughing stock they weren't treated as a laughing stock for the entire year. And that made it a lot more enjoyable to get through, because, over these last couple of years, they were just the butt of everybody's jokes, whether that was national writers or talking heads on ESPN, or even late night hosts were making fun of the Sixers. Having Embiid,
presidential candidates.
Yes, of course.
John Kasich. He got a. I don't know if this is even public, but Max kind of maybe tweeted a dig at him from the Sixers account by accident last year, and drew him into it.
Yeah, and that, I'm sure that got Ernie Johnson's vote. So they just weren't. I mean, with Embiid, they were cool, and the building was really exciting. The shame of it all was that Houston game in January. It's a random regular season game. There's nothing special about it except it was on national TV, and they were playing, a good team with an MVP candidate in James Harden. The building was rocking that night. It was sold out. People were into it, and of course, Embiid was awesome, despite probably playing on a torn meniscus. Was still awesome, and yeah, it was a much more enjoyable season to get through until the very end, until it all came crashing down. But God, especially last year, it was such a slog in January. I mean, there was nothing going on. God, we were arguing about whether Jahlil Okafor and Nerlens Noel could play together, and we weren't really arguing about it because we all knew the answer was no. We didn't know if those guys were good. There was just a lot there was a credibility that this team had this year. And from that standpoint, like as far as the PR and, Sam Hinkie got fired in large part because of the PR surrounding the team, whether that was fair or not. They seem to have gotten that stigma away from them, which is a good thing for sure.
Do you remember when the draft came around and they won the lottery and we were like, yes, we have 2 months to debate Ingram versus Embiid. And then we had our first post lottery podcast and we all agreed and thought it wasn't even a discussion. We're like, well, fuck, now what are we going to do? That was our content for 2 months. But yeah, it was, we were making up stuff to talk about for sure.
Well, hopefully we can make some stuff up to talk about during this draft.
Well, hopefully what happens is first of all, if you don't get the number 1 pick, there's going to be a lot of debate.
Yeah.
But if you get 2 picks, that's a lot of room for debate. So yeah, I'm hoping that this year, look, last year we found stuff to talk about, but I definitely remember being very excited that we would have the chance to debate the number 1 pick. And because before the lottery, it felt like there was actual diverging of opinions. And then the lottery got here and we're like, yeah, it's Simmons. And it was minor disappointment, but I don't want to complain about getting the number 1 pick in the draft. But I definitely thought we were going to have more debates about that.
So I want to bring his name up since he hasn't really come up yet, and it's been very Embiid-centric.
You got an emoji.
Well, no, not even that. Surprise, okay. Curveball.
We'll get to that later, but we have to talk. If Ben Simmons tweets an emoji, we have to talk about it.
Yeah. No, we haven't even really brought up Dario Saric yet. We've been waiting for him for years too, and I think part of the reason, which you guys just talked about, why it hasn't been as much of a slog down the stretch here since Embiid went down and the team's aspirations sort of went down with him, is because Dario he had a couple month stretch there where he was way better than I ever could have expected him to be at any point during his rookie season here, let alone after you would have thought he had long hit the rookie wall. And I think he certainly has run out of gas here. He's dealing with the plantar fasciitis here down in the last few games. But seeing him being able to step into such a big role and really have the offense run through him for long stretches of time once Embiid went down was really encouraging. And I think that's the difference between the last few years and this year, or one of the big differences anyway, was when they had the inevitable injury or downturn from their future piece or one of their best players, Saric sort of stepped in and filled that void and gave the fans something to hold on to. And I think he in some ways was even more divisive than Embiid the last couple of years, because a lot of the chatter from the talking heads outside of the city who didn't pay a lick of attention to anything that he had said publicly after being drafted was, oh, he's never coming over. He's going to come 3 years and he's going to be on the mid-level instead of being on the rookie contract. And just to have him come here and just prove so many different things wrong, including that, yeah, the kid can play a little bit, I think was a big emotional lift for a lot of the people who are the biggest diehards following this team.
Kyle, he has been so good. Jerry Colangelo even knows his name.
It's crazy. Uncle Jerry, all the way out in Phoenix on his Skype connection.
Do you remember
still watching Dario?
Jerry at one point was like, and then there's that guy in Turkey.
Oh my God.
Or that overseas kid. I forget exactly what it was, but he didn't even mention him by name.
Hey, Grand Canyon University just got a big recruit from overseas, I saw. So
Emily, the school that shall not be named for me. They're like the Voldemort of Sixers world.
Under Dan Marley, getting it done out there. Yeah. Dario was absolutely the MVP. When everybody was dropping flies around him in the second half, when the Sixers roster was, it was pretty barren. It was basically just him and Covington before, of course, he also tore his meniscus and, which seemed like it was inevitable. Dario stepped up into a bigger role, and not only, it was pretty amazing to see him get so much more responsibility. So of course his numbers, like his counting stats, are going to increase, but the quality of his play also increased by a good bit. And yeah, that was definitely encouraging to see. And it just validated the decision that Sam Hinkie made a few years ago to say, hey, we're not going to take the guy who you saw play Villanova a few times just because he'll be here this year. And we're gonna take the guy who we think is the best player, and if we have to wait a few years, that's fine, because sitting here right now, who would you rather have? It's pretty clear you'd rather have Dario Saric. So I mean, yeah, just everything about him's been fun. I mean, he's just first off, he's a fun personality. Just to see him mess around with TJ McConnell and see them sort of fight, and him sort of become assimilated to American culture and also the NBA game. He's been a lot of fun, and obviously he's going to play all 82 games here, assuming he suits up tomorrow. I would just advise to him, take a few weeks off, man. You earned it. And yeah, he's obviously not as important as Embiid, but it seems like he's a keeper, and that's a great thing to get from the 12th pick in the draft.
Yeah, you guys said it all. He's been terrific. And you're right. He was so inefficient to start the season coming off the bench with a combination of coming off the bench and starting, but with a much lower role regardless of whether he started or not. And then you threw him a bigger role and his efficiency went up, which is usually not the case. It will be interesting to see how he reacts to going back to the bench. If he does, Brett Brown did mention a potential starting lineup, or at least a lineup that intrigued him last night that included Simmons, Bayless, Covington, Saric, and Embiid. So we'll see if they carry through with that and how he would work in that kind of a lineup. But you do wonder if, there's going to be a little bit of adjustment when he doesn't have the ball quite as much. There was when he went over to Efes to play with them, so I assume he'll have another adjustment as well. But as long as that shot comes around, he's still going to be a very, very useful and very valuable player. Everything, like I said, the important players have played better than expected. It's just that ever-looming injury uncertainty that's hanging over the team. But that's what you get when you draft 7'2" big men with bad feet and bad back. So we shall see.
One other thing I wanted to add on Dario real quick. I think the most encouraging thing to me that we saw this year was my big question mark for him coming in was because of his athletic limitations, was he going to be able to use that sort of, I guess you could describe it as like an old man's game that he used overseas. It's one thing over there because you're playing against guys who are not as big or not as athletic, so you can get away with using a series of pump fakes and just sort of playing that bully ball. And I know Brett likes to call it, he's a bull in a china shop in the post. And I didn't know if you could necessarily do that at the NBA level. And I'm still skeptical he can do it at a high level of efficiency. But he certainly showed that he can do it at a proficient enough level that he can be an absolute contributor for this team. So I thought that was an important question that he needed to answer. And I think he pretty much already has.
Well, I mean, what I was going to say, through 51 games this year, that answer was a pretty resounding, at the very least, not yet. Because he was really struggling, both inside and outside of the arc, and athleticism did seem like it was getting in his way. Now the question comes, is 31 games enough to really prove that, or at least put that fully to rest? And probably not. The tough thing with rookies is that, if a 10-year vet has a 2-month stretch where he shoots better than expected, you go, oh, he's having a 2-month stretch where he's shooting better than expected. When a rookie does it, you assume improvement. Or at the very least, if not improvement, you assume that he's acclimating himself, that he's getting used to the speed and athleticism of the NBA game. And there are sides that I think weigh both too heavily. Like there are sides that will dismiss improvement late in the rookie year, and I think that's a little bit naive, to be honest, because I think it's like to say that there's not a huge that you really have to get acclimated, that there's not a huge adjustment, I think would be silly. But I do think sometimes we can dismiss the possibility that he's just having a good 2-month stretch as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But even so, even if he's not a great finisher inside, even if whatever rate he's doing it at right now, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but even if that's not a sustainable rate, it can still be better than it was to start the season, and he can still be a very useful contributor if that jump shot does come around. And Brett was very, very clear that jump shot is a huge priority, and he was also very clear that he thinks with a tweak here or there that he has a lot to work with and that he's anything but a non-shooter, which is something that I agree with. So, hopefully, like Rich says, he takes 2 to 3 weeks off, gets his feet back under him, comes back in the gym, and he doesn't have to be running 5-on-5 constantly, but gets a lot of shots up and gets a lot of shots up from the NBA range. I don't know exactly. Does anybody know what his summer commitments are? Like, does he have any international commitments this year that we know of?
I didn't look at it. I think he might actually. Again, I might have just seen this in passing, but isn't Eurobasket every other year? Like, don't they have something every year? Those European teams, they have Eurobasket, and then they have the Olympics, and then they have the World Cup. So in alternate years, I think there's a chance he might be deciding to play in that for Croatia this year.
We need to get that man a summer off.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a Eurobasket was last in 2015, so that means there will be one this summer, if I remember correctly. But yeah, my hope would be, I'm sure that Dario will end up playing because that's just sort of the guy that he is. That's his personality. But
it's hard to take his competitiveness and say we like that when he's playing for us, but not when he's playing for Croatia.
Right.
Like, that seems like a tough thing to do, but I think at some point it would really help him to get a couple months where he's off his feet somewhat.
Wouldn't this? I mean, doesn't Eurobasket have to do with qualifying for the World Cup though? So that's like the problem. Like, you can't just tell them like, hey, take a summer off and then play in the more important tournament next year, because they kind of need them if they really want to qualify for the bigger event.
Yeah, and Croatia is not something like Spain where you can say, okay, you're one of our best players, but go sit down. It doesn't work like that.
Well, if he played, Bogdanovic could take every shot then. That would be cool. I mean,
let's be honest, Rich.
It'd be like the pass at
every shot anyway.
It would be like the pass at the Tucker offense from Hey Arnold for anybody of a certain age.
God.
It would. Yeah, but I do think, I mean, he's got a lot of pride in playing for the Croatian team. So I actually do. I'm not 1,000% sure, but I'm pretty sure he's playing for them this summer. I would hope he spends at least, the rest of April generally off his feet wherever he is, though.
That is definitely the first Hey Arnold reference we have had on this podcast.
I don't know. It was in my mind. I don't exactly know why. All right. There's too much positivity going on. So obviously, like, we didn't even get to Covington and how good his defense is, and Rashawn, not making me rethink the Nerlens trade, but at least sort of softening the blow, I think, a little bit with how well he's played recently. Here's my question. So moving forward, what is your biggest fear when it comes to the front office? Like, trades? Is it okay? So would you say, like Kyle's report a few weeks ago, like the Paul George trade, saying that they would be okay giving up a major asset for Paul George when there's no guarantee that he'd sign here? Is it something like that? Or is it the Chris Dunn reported trade last year? Is there anything specific?
I mean, it is mostly based off of his history and a lot of the trades that were done to bring in complementary pieces in Toronto. But a guy like Paul George, I don't want to say I'm okay with an overpay, but I can at least be talked into an overpay on a guy like that because of how close I think he would get this team to, like, actually being relevant. So I don't think it's so much a concern about that, but it's, I guess I probably spoke a little too quickly. It's more based off of Toronto. Like, I just can't get the stink of Toronto out of my mind.
Well, in fairness, some of those trades are really stunk. So,
but I mean, like, I can't. So, like, there's obviously the Nerlens situation, and I don't think, Rich brought it up, but it doesn't matter how Rashawn plays. I still don't like the way that was handled. So there's that. But outside of that, I do, like, most of the concerns I had about Colangelo heading in, they haven't really come out to be true. So I almost want to give him the benefit of the doubt just a little bit. And even though the Nerlens situation is, you could argue, the most relevant, and certainly the most recent, the overall collective has been positive, and I think has gone against most of the concerns I had last summer. So I don't have right now the biggest, I guess what I'm looking at, a lot of times you're in a situation where you don't have the assets to get the Paul Georges or the Jimmy Butlers. So the trades, you have to be really realistic about what you're getting and what that's going to add to your team. But the Sixers have so many different avenues they can go down, so many different roads they can explore, that I look at the draft and I see ways to, really move the program forward in the draft. And I look at trades and I feel like Brett Brown's saying program. But I look at trades and they have so many assets they can move that even if they overpay for a really good guy, the team's in a really good spot going forward. So I think you're beyond where he was in Toronto, just because you're talking about much better people to bring in. You're not talking about the Jermaine O'Neals of the world and the guys who are past their prime, and you're desperate can fit in with, you know, your star to make him stay. Like, we're not talking about that situation. So I'm hopeful that his track record would be more like Phoenix and Toronto, but, you know, we'll see. We're obviously going on so little information.
So would you say that, yeah, I think you put it this way earlier this season when we were sort of talking about last offseason, Derek. Would you still say it's, you know, it's almost like it would be unfair to give him a grade because he barely took one pop quiz? You know, it's not like he's done anything of like value, good or bad, yet that really has any lasting long-term effects, except, you know, maybe the Nerlens trade.
Well, and the Ben Simmons trade. But like I said, you don't get too many points from me from signing your name on the SAT.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if Rich, if you want to go, by all means.
I don't really have a long point. I guess this is just something that I just thought about. You know, there's so many questions about the medical staff, and obviously, like, I don't really like talking about that much because, like, we don't know exactly what's going on back there, and I'm not sure we'll ever know. And, like, you know, the answer might be just that all of their guys got hurt, and they have a bunch of injury-prone players, and that can happen sometimes.
We're all waiting for the Ned Cohen tell-all book.
Sure, absolutely. But I guess the weird thing is that Colangelo was there in Phoenix when, like, their training staff has always been considered, like, you know, almost like wizards, yeah. And yeah, I don't know. I guess that sort of just hit me that it's kind of funny that Brian Colangelo, who I'm pretty sure, I don't know how much say he had in hiring those guys, but I'm sure he had some because he was there the whole time, is now leading a team that is just their medical staff is just under siege from all, basically getting, you know, laughed at from pretty much everywhere around the NBA.
Yeah. It's just like, so that we're not focusing too intently on the medical staff with this criticism, I think the biggest, and I brought this up at the beginning, but the reason I would be concerned, not just about who they have making those decisions and informing their decisions there, but both the optics and just the results of it makes it seem like they bent to public whims a little bit. Like that game against the Rockets that Embiid
or Joel's whims
looks like nothing more than right. But if in fact they knew enough about his knee there, that they knew about the meniscus, they know about the bone bruise, all that, there's absolutely no way he should be playing in that game. And they have to be an organization that's going to say, look, you are more hurt than you probably realize, and you're not going to play. We need to get you reevaluated. We have to assess options as far as treatment. You can't just it just looks so lackadaisical and just it's a bad look for the organization any way you want to spin it. And that sort of stuff really concerns me because we went into last season expecting like they're going to do things that might end up being negative things that are going to be more about serving their image rather than being the best thing for the team. And that didn't really come to fruition in terms of the trades they made, the type of offseason signings they made. They didn't overspend really. They didn't bring in the type of players who are going to take roles and minutes away from young players for the most part. And they had a pretty good draft as we sit here today. Might end up being a really good draft when we have a couple more years to judge it. But the way that they handled that Embiid thing, and I know that he obviously has his say there, that is still, that might end up being like the canary in the coal mine where it's like, well, I don't, that might have been the first sign of trouble there, that they were more concerned with the optics there that, oh, we want to have our star rookie on TV and we'll sort of let him make that decision rather than exerting our influence and saying, hey, we really need to be more patient with this and you're too important to us to that would be the thing that I'm most concerned about, is that they're too concerned with things that are outside of their control, how people view them. Look, if a guy's hurt, you got to deal with it. You can't sit there and say, well, this is the context is important. We got to look good for ESPN and everybody else. Like, I don't want that to be the way the organization is run, and they shouldn't want that to be the way the organization is run. They have to make decisions that serve their long-term interests the best. And playing a potential superstar when he's hurt and allow him to expose himself to even further risk of injury is just not good.
The Houston game, yeah, I mean, we've talked about the medical staff, and, you know, despite what I said about, like, you know, being a little bit reticent to criticize them, the evidence on that Houston game is, you know, it's pretty overwhelming that he probably shouldn't have been playing that night, and almost definitely shouldn't have been playing.
Yeah, and look, we might not know who to blame, but ultimately, I mean, look, it's a department that's under the jurisdiction of Brian Colangelo and under his purview. So he, you know, if he's going to take credit for the Sun staff that he built, and like Rich said, like you would assume that he had some role in that, well, he has some role in this decision making as well, so he's got to take these lumps. And I guess ultimately you just hope that they learn from them and don't make the same mistakes again. But freaking Christ, that is our franchise player. Don't make that mistake with him ever. It was tough. And the fact that we don't know who exactly to pin the blame on or exactly how much blame to pin on because we're not privy to the medical information doesn't take away from the fact that it would be very hard to convince me that there was a mistake made. So, yes, I agree with you.
Well, and I will say, I was at that Houston game. Jerry Colangelo was about 10 rows behind me at that game, just sort of sitting in the crowd anonymously. So I don't think he's down. At least I haven't spotted him down there at the games very often. And if this, like, not to get all too conspiracy theory here, but he clearly wanted to be there because they're on national TV. And you think he wanted to show up to that game and get interviewed in a game that Embiid's not playing in and they're getting blown out? I don't think so. I don't think he's that kind of guy. So you can connect whatever dots you want to. I just think there are a lot of that game in particular and just the sort of thought process that it takes to do something like that. That's not going to sit well with me really ever, let alone while we're still dealing with Embiid recovering from the injury that he was playing through during that game.
Yeah, Jerry Colangelo, Kevin Hart, M. Night Shyamalan was in the house that night. I don't know. Cranston was probably there earlier that week. They started to get some celebs this year too, which was pretty cool. I'll be interested
Rich
to see
Hofmann.
Oh yeah, I mean,
no more Nicki Minaj though, since she broke up with Meek.
She might want to get back. Well, I mean, I'm not gonna go there, but but if they get good, I think going to the games with me. I mean, Meek Mill was obviously there a bunch too. I think you get some FaceTime on national TV for big games.
I think she's good on the publicity front, but I could be wrong.
I don't know, man. I don't know what you kids are listening to these days, but no, yeah, I think she's definitely okay with that.
But before the season, and we were all too lazy to go back and check our preseason predictions, did any of us? None of us had them at 28 wins, right? Like, there's no way.
I think
not
high end.
not
I would have. If I had gone high end, I might have said 25, and I don't even know if I went that high.
I think I said 20.
Yeah, I think I was after the Simmons news. I think I was in the mid 20s. I'd have to double check, and I'm too lazy for that. But yeah, I mean, for them to win 28 games when Embiid played in 31 and Simmons played in 0, like we said, the real winner, Brett Brown, the guys who have developed, it really is startling after an 0-7 start, and now so far an 0-7 finish. You take those two out, and they're almost a 500 team in the middle there. So hopefully they can build on that. But it's so tough with the injuries. But anything else you really want to bring up here? Or, I mean, like I said, we're going to do another one of these when they have, I think, players talking on Thursday for the end of season stuff. And then Brett Brown, and I don't know if Colangelo and or Harris are talking on Friday, but if they do, that would probably be the day. So we'll probably have another one of these then for reactions. Maybe give some awards, most improved, MVP, that kind of stuff. But any real thoughts on, just the expectations going in?
Well, so I do want to say we didn't give it a specific shout out, despite the fact that we praised Embiid a lot. But the defense this year when Embiid was on the court was just absolutely spectacular. And part of that was the improvement of a guy like Robert Covington, which was I don't know that I ever would have expected him to make the leap he did as a defender. I certainly hope for him to take strides, but he was just flat out phenomenal this year. And I've said this before, but think he deserves real consideration for all defense this year at the end of the year. I know it's tough sledding there, but at least deserves a look. But for the team that in their most played 5-man lineup, which I believe was Embiid, McConnell, Covington, Ilyasova, and Nick Stauskas, believe it or not, they had a defensive rating of 90 as a group, which is just, that would be by far the best defense in the NBA if it was played at any sort of extended minutes. And if Embiid is there, if Covington is there, and you add in some other guys who are more defensively minded, this team can be an absolutely elite defense going forward as long as all the key players can remain on the court. And that, I know that Brett Brown, that's been a point of emphasis for him the whole time he's been here. But the fact that they finally really turned that corner for an extended stretch this year was very encouraging for me.
Yeah, I mean,
I still think in the 800 or so minutes when Embiid played, I still think they have what would be the best defensive rating in the league in that time. I mean, that's
in January they were playing at a championship point differential.
Yeah.
No, but
that was 15 games. It's not insignificant.
Yeah. I mean, and when he played, it was only like 300 minutes when he played, or maybe even a little less. But it was above championship level. I think the Warriors are around like a 13, 14 net rating. They were an 18 net rating with Joel Embiid on the floor. The Sixers. I mean, these are, again, we talked about these guys taking strides. These guys are not championship caliber players. That's how good Joel Embiid is. They were doing this with TJ McConnell, who, we would freak out about a net rating in the past when a player would go a season and only be like a -3. We'd be like, holy shit, do you see how much better they were when he was on the court? To be in the positive is insane. Sixers fans don't have players in the positive. No, it almost got to the point where you never thought you were going to see a player in the positive again. It was sort of like seeing the sun for the first time in forever. It was like, whoa, I didn't realize that this could happen. But that's just the type of presence that Embiid is.
240 minutes in January. They were a +16 with a 91 defensive rating.
Ugh.
And 240. Yeah, it was insane. Every time I go back and I look at the numbers in January, I just get really depressed over what happened in February, March, and April, because I wanted another 3 months of that. I wanted to at least trick ourselves into a playoff run. You still get a top 7 or 8 pick because of the Kings. It was all lining up. Instead, we're going to have to enjoy Markelle Fultz.
Buddy, if they get Markelle Fultz, I'm going to start planning the parade. I don't know about you.
Have you seen, by the way, Markelle Fultz going on a tour of all the East Coast teams? Terrible teams that could make a pick? First off, he saw the Sixers get absolutely drilled by the Nets, and then he got to see the triangle offense up close get destroyed by Toronto. He hasn't seen the greatest basketball in the world down the stretch here.
Well, being an East Coast guy, he is from Maryland. Being an East Coast guy, he gets the benefit of seeing all the teams that are likely to draft him, and the downside of seeing all the teams that are likely to draft him.
We were cracking up the other night. He was just sitting courtside, and nobody knew who he was.
No, but Rich and I were just, to be fair, at first I glanced, because he's wearing a hat, he was kind of behind his friend, and I'm glancing because we knew he was supposed to be there. I think Jake Pavorsky reported it. And I'm like, hey, have you seen him yet? And he points, and he's like, he's right there. And I'm like, oh, okay, I see him now. But then we just sat there and watched for a good 20 to 30 minutes, and he's right. People came up and sat next to him, their seats were next to him, and they had no idea. It was funny.
Well, and these were dudes in Sixers jerseys.
Yeah,
these did not look like casual fans by any means.
Well, and so let me just make a quick point off of that real quick. I think part of that is, and a lot of people won't admit this, and the only reason why it's even close, why people have tried to debate that Fultz isn't the number one guy this year, is because very few people actually watched him play because his team was so bad. I honestly believe that that's a thing. Like,
well, I mean,
nobody wants to watch that. They were a garbage team, despite the fact that they had who I think is head and shoulders the best prospect. But because they're so bad and because they play on the West Coast and their games are on, it was not always easy to find their games versus some other guys, like the Kentucky guys are on ESPN constantly. I really think that there are not a lot of people out there that have actually watched that kid play extended minutes.
Yeah, well, I mean, the team was bad. They were on the West Coast. They weren't on national TV all that much. They didn't play in any tournaments. Like, there's a lot of reason that his profile was really low, but still, if you're a big enough fan that you have an Embiid jersey and you're buying courtside seats, maybe you look up the number one prospect in the draft that you hope to get. It was a little bit surprising. I guess we didn't really talk all that much about Ben Simmons' checkmark. I think we did briefly mention it. We'll probably talk about it when we get some actual information on what that checkmark means. We can certainly all speculate that he's been cleared, and I did send out a couple of texts while this went on, but nothing has been responded to. No statement from the team. So, like I said, we'll probably do another one of these podcasts towards the end of the week and or over the weekend. But thank you guys for hopping on, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. See you guys.
See you guys.
You've been listening to the Sixers Beat right here on LibertyBallers.com and LibertyBroadcast.co.